the $200 billion AI war that's going on that nobody is talking about. So everybody thinks that the AI war is about ChatGPT versus Claude versus Gemini, but really there's something much more profound, much bigger, much more deep, global at play here, because behind all of these models basically is something much bigger occurring. And what that is, Google are at the center of this, and an extraordinary infrastructure financing machine reportedly worth over $200 billion. And it's largely being constructed around Anthropic, the company behind Claude, believe it or not. And that's what we're going to get into in this video. So stick around, and by the end of it, you'll understand what's going on in the world of AI, the business of AI today. So this is not just a number. This is $200 billion, which is not to buy Anthropic. It's not about the 200 bill per se. It's the play that's happening here that is vital to understand. So this is not Anthropic's valuation, to be clear. So this 200 bill is to help provide the chips, the data, the centers, the physical computing infrastructure required to run AI. And once you understand where the money's actually going, you realize that AI is starting to look a lot less like the software industry. That's what we're all playing this on, that it's going to be software industry 0.2, but it's a lot more like an energy industry or telecommunications or aviation. And these also tie into the aspects of that AI is likely to be governmentalized, nationalized. We're already seeing that with the big kind of AI war going on between China and the US, and also the fact that immigration is going to be affected by AI. And what I mean by that is that you're going to see the top talent in the world relocate to jurisdictions and locations that have access to all of the tools. So this 200 bill story, though, could be one of the biggest infrastructure build-outs of our entire generation. Bear in mind, we missed the telecoms, big telecoms infrastructure boom, the road networks, the aviation networks, things that we take for granted that essentially change the world. This is why AI is such a vast opportunity and why it's so important to understand the business of AI. But this also kind of raises a slightly uncomfortable question. So are we really building, the next infrastructure for the internet, or are we actually financing one of the biggest bubbles in history? So let's funnel the money and let's dive into it rather and find out. So here's what's exactly happening with the detail. Anthropic needs an unbelievable amount of computing power. Now, Claude doesn't just magically exist in the cloud. Obviously, every question, every coding task, every AI agent, every enterprise customer requires physical chips sitting inside physical data centers consuming real compute, real electricity, real energy, and there's humans who need to obviously manage that. Now, and increasingly Anthropic has been using Google's own AI chips, believe it or not, which are called TPUs, okay? Tensor Processing Units. Now, Google's been developing these chips for years as an alternative to Nvidia's chips, and eliminating that entire reliance on Nvidia. And now Google appears to have found an incredibly clever way of massively expanding the ecosystem around these TPUs. So instead of Google simply spending $200 billion itself, Wall Street actually gets involved, or are getting involved with this. Private credit is now getting involved with this. Infrastructure companies are getting involved with this. So they're spreading the risk across the board. So chip companies are also investing in this. Data center developers are also getting involved. And together, they're financing enormous amounts of equipment via Google that Anthropic needs. So roughly 150 billion of the reported financing for this relates to chips, with a number of different benefactors involved to flush in the capital to make this happen. So Broadcom is also deeply involved because it works with Google on the TPU hardware, and these chips can essentially be bought by financing vehicles and then leased to Anthropic. So this is a big aspect of the AI world now, is leasing compute power. So in essence, Anthropic, they'll get the compute, Broadcom, who are, selling the hardware essentially, and then Google expands the TPU ecosystem. They get those TPUs everywhere. They build a bigger moat around their importance in the AI space, and they also increase their potential as a real competitor to Nvidia. And then ultimately, Wall Street will earn their fees and their interest. Now, investors also get the exposure to the AI boom, and it's almost really like financing an airline, believe it or not, when you think about it, when you look at all the aspects of it. So the airline, doesn't necessarily pay cash up front for every aircraft, obviously not. Someone typically finances the aircraft, or the airline leases it, for example, huge industry, aircraft leasing, or the manufacturer ultimately sells more planes because of that ecosystem. So the financier earns money on their interest, except instead of it being a Boeing aircraft, we're talking about, in this instance, in the AI instance, enormous clusters of artificial intelligence processors. That's the big thing at play here. So This is how capital intensive AI is essentially becoming. Now, you might be thinking, why would Google do something like this? But you might reasonably ask as well, why would Google help Anthropic? But this is what's happening behind the scenes. All these companies are interweaved into each other. So Anthropic is in theory a competitor. Claude competes directly with Gemini on the front end, the B2C end, but Google is also an investor in Anthropic, and people forget this. And more importantly, Google wants Anthropic using Google's infrastructure, because it's all about the deep infrastructure. And this is important if you're an investor, if you're playing the stock market at the moment, understanding what's going on here, because there's another giant competition happening underneath the chatbot war, and that is that Nvidia has basically what are called CUDA and GPUs. Amazon has Trainium and Inferentia, and Google has TPUs. These are all their different kind of chips from each individual brand, and every major technology company wants its hardware and cloud infrastructure to become the foundation that AI companies build on top of, essentially, because ultimately if that happens, you don't necessarily need to win a consumer chatbot war. You can make money regardless of which AI application ultimately wins, because you've hedged your bets, you're involved in everything, you've got kind of fingers in every pie, and that's the classic really gold rush business. You can dig for the gold, or you can sell the equipment that to help everybody who's doing the digging, or you can also own the infrastructure, and that's what the big heavy players are doing, and that is why Google are increasingly trying to do both. Gemini is doing the front end digging, they're handling the B2C, they're also targeting governmental contracts, things like that. Anthropic are doing the same thing, they're doing the digging, and Google potentially will get paid either way, because if Anthropic wins the race, or if Gemini wins the race, then they're winning on both sides. That's a very important and interesting aspect of this business that most of us are not aware of. And now Wall Street is inside the AI boom, as we know. But here's where it all gets much bigger. AI isn't being financed purely by Silicon Valley by any stretch anymore. We're seeing enormous amounts of capital come in from, for example, private credit. We're looking at banks, we're talking infrastructure funds, we're looking at asset managers and specialist financing vehicles. And that is important. And the reason is because the AI race is becoming too expensive for even the largest technology companies to actually finance traditionally. Imagine the likes of Google or Microsoft going out for credit. That's what's happening. Data centers cost billions. Chips cost absolutely billions. Power infrastructure costs absolutely billions of dollars, and networking similarly, cooling similarly, and even talent equally. So the demand is growing so quickly that these companies don't want to wait to gradually kind of build up capacity over time. They're effectively pulling true AI demand forward, pulling it forward massively, and financing infrastructure today based on what they believe AI will ultimately need tomorrow. And that is an enormous bet. Now, Nvidia has released the same thing here, and Google isn't alone. So Nvidia reportedly wants to invest up to $3 billion in Lancium. So Lancium is involved in developing the massive Stargate data center campus in Texas, which a lot of people will have heard about. But why would the world's most valuable AI chip company start investing in power and data center infrastructure? So the reason is because ultimately Nvidia has a problem here. And what is that? It's an incredible, really, success problem to have, truth be told, but it's ultimately still a problem, is that you can't sell unlimited GPUs if nobody is anywhere to ultimately plug them in and play them, because otherwise you're going to run out of buyers rather, and at some point the bottleneck stops being the chips and really becomes the land, the electricity, the transformers, the cooling, the grid connections, the data centers. So it's absolutely incredible what's happening here. Nvidia can produce increasingly powerful processors, but if customers can't physically, tangibly deploy those processors, then Nvidia can't recognize and realize the revenue. They can't actually make money from those. So now Nvidia has an incentive to help genuinely build the infrastructure that ultimately buys Nvidia products. So think about how vertically connected this all becomes here. Nvidia, they invest in infrastructure. Infrastructure companies build data centers, AI companies lease capacity, and then data centers buy Nvidia GPUs. So the full cycle here, they're really smart. Nvidia ultimately will sell more chips, and then suddenly Nvidia isn't merely selling shovels out to the gold rush guys, they're helping finance the actual mine, and then, the mine ultimately is where the demand for the shovels come from. So you can see the picture here, and it's brilliant if that demand keeps rising. Now, there's a bigger problem with this, which is the electricity issue. And there's another layer underneath all of it, and that is the power. And I don't mean the physical power, I'm talking about the electrical power. So AI models require enormous amounts of electricity, and increasingly power availability is becoming one of the biggest constraints on the entire industry. We're starting to see AI companies and data center developers looking at basically gas plants, looking again at nuclear, believe it or not, big push to talk about nuclear for AI and how that could be the way, renewables, we're talking battery storage, and dealing directly with energy producers. That is how AI companies are going now. So Microsoft has been making major energy commitments, Google has been making equal kind of energy commitments, and Amazon has been making the same. So OpenAI's infrastructure ambitions increasingly involve power as much as computing. And this is why kind of saying AI is a software revolution and almost undersells what's really happening here. Software revolutions typically meant, build software, put it on servers, pump out subscriptions, get tons of monthly recurring revenue. But this is entirely different, as you can see. So AI increasingly requires actual physical industrial scale infrastructure. And most of us are not thinking about that. And that means that AI spending will spill into things like semiconductors, construction, utilities, energy, real estate, financing, networking, and manufacturing. So the economic footprint is enormous. So whichever way you look at that, that could be a massive boon, could be a massive positive, or it could be a massive negative. Some people see it as a negative based on the environment. But does AI actually make enough money is a bigger question as we step away from this concept of the gargantuan expenditure. Now that we get the question that really matters here, because if we're going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars building AI infrastructure, someone eventually has to pay for it. And here's where the story gets super interesting. And that is that AI companies are starting to generate some serious revenue. I'm talking very serious revenue here. An analysis of 32 native AI companies found that their combined annualized revenue had doubled from roughly 15 billion to more than 30 billion in just the last 7 months. Now that's extraordinary growth in anyone's books. I think it's probably the biggest in human history. Companies are clearly rather paying for AI, and consumers are obviously the same, developers are the same, and enterprise adoption and governmental adoption as well is accelerating. So this isn't just some tech with zero customers and zero revenue. The demand is genuine and real, but there is a catch to it. A huge percentage of that revenue is concentrated in just a handful of companies. So OpenAI and Anthropic alone represent 85% of the revenue in that data set. 85%. And the top 10 companies represent around 94%. So beyond the top 10, given the top 2 or 85, there's very little happening. So we're simultaneously seeing basically explosive AI revenue growth and enormous concentration. There might be thousands of AI startups, but economically, a relatively small number of companies are dominating. So, and they're actually burning enormous amounts of cash within this. But there's another problem here. Generating AI revenue is ultimately very expensive, and these aren't traditional software margins. If I sell you a normal piece of software, for example, the incremental cost of letting one person use it can be extremely low. But AI is different. Every time you ask a frontier model to do something, compute gets consumed. And frontier model companies are spending enormous amounts of money training models and serving customers. Across that group of AI native companies, annual cash burn has been estimated above $20 billion. So there's a bit of a juncture or a bit of a mix up here happening. Is this profitable or is this burning cash? And that's where the numbers start to get genuinely extraordinary. You've got tens of billions in AI revenue, tens of billions in losses and infrastructure spending, and hundreds of billions being financed to build the next generation of capacity, and potentially trillions of dollars of infrastructure required over the longer term. And this is why AI businesses and the story of AI is becoming much more interesting than the tech story. The tech is obviously incredible. It's life-changing. It's ultimately the most amazing thing that probably any of us could have imagined in our life cycle. But the economics are almost unprecedented. Now, the question is this a bubble? This is where everybody immediately jumps to the .com comparison here. And for sure, there are certainly similarities. Massive investor excitement, extraordinary valuations, companies spending ahead of demand, infrastructure being built on very aggressive forecasts, capital flooding into almost everything with an AI angle. And some of these investments will unquestionably rather turn out to be absolutely terrible. This happens in every tech boom, but there's another lesson for the .com era that people ultimately forget, and that's the internet bubble burst, but the internet wasn't a bubble. Billions were wasted, companies disappeared for sure, investors lost absolute fortunes in endless cases, but the infrastructure stayed. Fiber optic cables, data centers, networks, digital infrastructure, and eventually companies like Google, Meta, Amazon, Netflix have built gigantic businesses on top of that. So they're two completely different questions here when you start to understand them and just get away from the silly, quick, light reference. Are some AI investments overvalued and unsound? Probably, very likely. But is the underlying AI value infrastructure going to become enormously important? I think the evidence is increasingly pointing towards yes. So the biggest winners may not be who we expect here. And this is the part that I'm watching most closely. So if you're an investor or you're looking for your opportunity in the market, this is it. Everyone wants to know, will OpenAI win? Will Anthropic win? It's a lazy question. Will Gemini win? And maybe this is where the easiest money is. Think about every layer required for those companies to compete. We're talking chips, Nvidia, Broadcom, AMD. We're talking memory, the likes of SK Hynix. We're talking Micron. We're talking, if we look at networking, and data centers, power, cooling, construction, financing, recruitment, land. The applications, at the top, they're going to change consistently. But today's number one model could be number 3 next year. But every one of those models ultimately needs infrastructure. And that's why the picks and shovels thesis has worked so insanely well for Nvidia. And that's why investors are now hunting for the next bottleneck. So Nvidia solved the compute piece. Then the memory piece became crucial, and now electricity is becoming crucial, and then the likes of cooling, and then data center capacity, and then inference optimization. So ultimately, as you can see, every bottleneck creates another big business opportunities, and that's what entrepreneurs should learn from this. And there's a broader lesson here, if you are building a business or if you're an executive in a business, is that don't automatically chase the most obvious part of this tech boom where everybody sees the opportunity. Look one layer beneath it. So, if ChatGPT explodes tomorrow, who supplies the chips? Nvidia explodes, who supplies the electricity? If AI agents explode and just go off the grid, ask who helps companies reduce the cost of running them. That's a big opportunity as well. The service provider of running AI agents and keeping things lean. If we're looking at data centers, you could be asking who supplies the cooling network, the power management, and the security even on these centers. That's another big business opportunity. So sometimes the biggest businesses are not creating the headlines. It's solving the problem created by the headline, the drop-down tiers. And this is one of the reasons I think following the business of AI right now is so interesting, because there's such a spillover into different areas. We're watching an entirely new economic supply chain ultimately being made in real life. So that is it. We come back to Google's reported 200 billion infrastructure machine being built around Anthropic. Is it insane? Possibly. Could parts of it blow up? Absolutely. The entire structure ultimately depends on companies like Anthropic continuing to generate enough demand and enough revenue to justify enormous long-term infrastructure commitments. And if that growth disappoints, then someone eventually will own a very expensive pile of chips and data centers. But if AI demand continues to grow at anything close to the rate we've seen, then Google might have done something incredible this year. And it's basically helped build an ecosystem where Wall Street finances the infrastructure, Broadcom supplies the hardware, Anthropic consumes the compute power, and Google's tech sits underneath all of that. So Google doesn't need every dollar sitting on its own balance sheet, not at all. But if it still helps expand the world around Google's AI infrastructure, then that is sophisticated, and it's a glimpse of what the AI race is becoming, which is becoming increasingly fascinating every single day.